Welcome to American Gang War. Tonight, we're going deep into the streets of South Central Los Angeles, a place where loyalty is tested, colors define life or death, and history bleeds into every block. What started as brotherhood turned into betrayal. What began as protection became war. This is the story of the Broadway Gangster Crips and the East Coast Crips, two sets born under the same flag, now locked in one of LA's deadliest internal feuds. From drive-bys to revenge hits, from Imperial to San Pedro, this isn't just street violence. It's a war that shaped a generation. You're watching American Gang War, and this is the deadly LA War. South Central Los Angeles, a place that birthed legends, movements, and wars that shaped generations. By the early 1970s, the city was changing fast. Factories were shutting down, families were struggling to survive, and the streets were rewriting the rules of loyalty. In the middle of it all, a group of young men from the west side of South Central decided to create something of their own. Something that would give them identity, protection, and power. They called themselves the Broadway Boys. Back then, it wasn't about guns and murder. It was about respect. They were neighborhood kids, playing ball, hanging on corners, chasing girls. But in a city divided by race, poverty, and police pressure, that neighborhood pride soon became survival. The Broadway Boys posted up along a stretch of South Broadway that ran from Imperial to Century, between Avalon and San Pedro. These blocks were theirs. They weren't looking to start trouble, but they weren't running from it either. As the years passed, the street life hardened. The 1970s brought the birth of the Crips and Bloods across Los Angeles. Names like Raymond Washington, Stanley Tookie Williams, and countless others were spreading their blue flag culture from the East Side to Compton, to Watts, and beyond. The Broadway Boys decided to take on a stronger identity. They added one word that would define them forever: gangster. From that moment, they became the Broadway Gangster Crips. They represented loyalty, street code, and hustle. They were tight-knit, built on family and proximity. But as with every set in South LA, unity soon gave way to rivalries. The same streets that raised them would soon turn into battlefields. Two major subsets formed under the Broadway name: the 5 Deuce Broadways, representing around 52nd Street, and the 11 Deuce Broadways, holding it down around 112th Street. These two divisions were like brothers from the same bloodline, separated by geography, but united by the Broadway identity. The 1970s were about foundation. The 1980s would be about survival. As the decade turned, the crack epidemic exploded. Money, addiction, and murder became the new trinity of South Central life. The Broadways were in the middle of it, hustling to survive while defending their name from enemies on all sides. They had issues with the Hoovers, once allies, now rivals. There were problems with neighborhood Crips, with Bloods like the Denver Lanes and the Main Street sets. But one of the most bitter rivalries that would eventually define their history was with another Crip faction, the East Coast Crips. The East Coast Crips had their roots deep on the east side of Los Angeles, stretching from 62nd all the way through 190th. They were large, disciplined, and respected. To the Broadways, they were competition. To the East Coasts, Broadway was another set standing in their way. What started as distant tension slowly turned personal. A disrespect here, a shooting there. And soon enough, the two blue flags were pointing guns at each other. The 1980s in South Central were a perfect storm. Poverty, drugs, gangs, and police corruption all swirling together. The LAPD declared war on the streets, but the streets declared war back. Helicopters hovered nightly. Mothers kept their kids inside after sunset. The air was heavy with tension, and everybody knew it could go down at any time. One event, in particular, would forever scar the history of Broadway: the 54th Street Massacre. It was 1984, and the neighborhood was already on edge from weeks of violence. A party was being thrown on 54th Street. Locals, family, kids, everybody just trying to enjoy the night. But that peace didn't last long. Someone's car was taken earlier in the evening. In retaliation, the owners came back strapped. Shots rang out into the crowd. People screamed and ran in every direction. When it was over, 11 people were dead, including a 17-year-old girl, a sister, a daughter, someone who wasn't even banging. The community was shattered. That shooting wasn't just about revenge. It was a message. South Central had reached a point of no return. Every life lost created another reason for payback. Every funeral birthed another shooter. The Broadways, like every set around them, adapted. They got deeper into the crack trade, deeper into the streets. They learned that in LA, survival meant staying armed, staying loyal, and staying quiet. As the decade rolled on, their reputation grew. The Broadway Gangster Crips were known for being organized, for handling business, and for being down to ride. Their hoods, from 52nd to 112th, became well-known names in the gang world. The East Coasts were rising too, building their own legend. Their sets, 62 East Coast, 76 East Coast, 97, 102, 190, were all connected, spreading across the East Side and beyond. They were big, they were unified, and they had deep ties with other Crip sets. The seeds of the Broadway versus East Coast war were already planted. Nobody could predict how far it would go, but those who lived through the 80s could feel it coming. The energy in the city was too raw, too emotional, too violent to ever stay calm. By the end of the decade, Broadway had earned respect and fear in equal measure. The blue flags flew high, the police watched closely, and the funerals came too often. But in every candlelight vigil and every memorial T-shirt, there was one message that echoed through South Central: Broadway forever. The stage was set for a new chapter, one where peace treaties would be tested, loyalty would be questioned, and entire generations would pay the price for decisions made decades earlier. The 1990s hit Los Angeles like a tidal wave. The city was still recovering from the crack wars of the 80s, but the scars were fresh. Bullets still lodged in walls, families still broken, and money still moving on every corner. The Broadways had survived the storm, but the war never truly stopped. Every day was another test. Cops raided the blocks like it was a sport. Helicopters lit up the sky. Rival sets were watching from across streets and alleys. In the hood, paranoia wasn't weakness. It was survival. But in 1992, something historic happened. Something that, for a brief moment, made the city believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. April 29th, 1992. The day the Rodney King verdict dropped. The world saw the video. LAPD officers beating a man on camera, swinging batons like his life meant nothing. And then the jury said, not guilty. That verdict lit a fire that had been building for decades. Los Angeles exploded. Riots tore through the city. Stores burned. Police cars flipped. People looted, not out of greed, but out of rage. South Central became a war zone, not between gangs this time, but between the people and the system that had crushed them for years. Amid all that chaos, something powerful was happening quietly in the streets. A truce. Old enemies started talking. Hood legends, OGs from the Bloods and Crips, started realizing that the real enemy wasn't always the dude from the next block. The system had been killing them slowly for years. In Watts, leaders from the Grape Street Crips, P.J. Watts Crips, and the Bounty Hunter Bloods sat down and brokered what became known as the Watts Peace Treaty. It was supposed to be a symbol of change, a new era where black men would stop killing each other and start rebuilding their neighborhoods. The movement started spreading. Across South Central, other sets began reaching out. Some Broadways even talked to their rivals. There were whispers of truces, alliances, and ceasefires. For a second, it felt like hope. But hope in the hood is fragile. Because while some were ready for peace, others still had blood on their hands, and too many losses to forgive. The Broadway Gangster Crips, strong and proud, had seen too many of their homies buried to trust anyone outside their circle. The East Coast Crips felt the same way. The wounds between those two sets ran deep, and no treaty could fix that overnight. There were attempts, meetings in parks, neutral hoods, old heads trying to mediate. But the young homies didn't see things that way. They were still dealing with the ghosts of the 80s, revenge that hadn't been handled, pride that hadn't been swallowed. The 1990s was also when the music started shining a light on the streets. Rappers like Ice Cube, N.W.A., and DJ Quick were putting LA gang life into the mainstream. Everybody across America was suddenly talking about Compton, South Central, and Watts. What the world saw as entertainment for the Broadways and East Coasts was their everyday life. And with fame came more attention from law enforcement. The LAPD launched their crash units, community resources against street hoodlums, an ironic name for squads that were just as violent as the streets they patrolled. Cops like Rafael Perez and David Mack were making headlines, not for stopping crime, but for being part of it. The streets didn't trust the police, and the police didn't trust the streets. That tension made everything worse. Within Broadway, cracks started forming. Different age sets had different visions. The older heads wanted structure, business, and control. The younger generation, born into war, only knew retaliation. The same thing was happening on the East Coast side. The larger their set grew, the more internal friction started brewing. Some were focused on money, others on power, others on revenge. And just when the city started to catch its breath after the riots, the music industry gave LA another shockwave. Tupac Shakur's rise. Pac wasn't from Broadway or East Coast, but his message hit close to home. He was rapping about the same streets, the same pain, the same broken system. His words gave a voice to the voiceless. But when he got caught in the middle of the death row versus bad boy conflict, it reminded everyone that even fame couldn't escape the politics of the streets. After Pac's death in '96, something shifted. The peace talk started dying down. The new generation didn't care about truces. They wanted their respect, by any means necessary. And that's when the Broadway versus East Coast tension came back to the surface, stronger, colder, and deadlier. The 1990s had begun with hope, peace treaties, truce meetings, community barbecues. But by the end of the decade, the blocks were back at war. The Broadways were losing soldiers to drive-bys and prison. The East Coasts were getting hit just as hard. LAPD raids, indictments, And gang enhancements meant that every time someone got locked up, another young shooter stepped in to fill their place. And with every retaliation came another funeral. It wasn't about drugs anymore. It wasn't even about money. It was about pride, about who could walk down what street and still live to tell it. South Central had become a graveyard of dreams. The war between Broadway and East Coast was no longer just about turf. It was about legacy. Who controlled the story? Who survived long enough to tell it? By the late 1990s, both sets had built names that commanded fear across LA. Their colors, their codes, their respect. It all carried weight. But so did their losses. For every victory on the streets, there was a mother crying in a church pew. For every retaliation, another child grew up fatherless. And as the millennium approached, both the Broadway Gangster Crips and the East Coast Crips faced a new reality. The streets they fought for were changing. Developers were moving in. The police were more aggressive. The neighborhood was slowly being taken apart by gentrification, one block at a time. The streets that once defined their power were now worth millions in real estate, but not for the people who bled for them. The Broadways didn't know it yet, but the 2000s would bring a whole new kind of war, not just with guns, but with survival in a city that no longer wanted them there. By the time the new millennium hit, the world had changed, but the streets of South Central hadn't caught up yet. The crack era had slowed down, but the damage it left behind was still visible. Burned out houses, faded murals of fallen homies, street corners that felt haunted. The Broadway Gangster Crips were still active, still holding it down from Imperial to Century, from Broadway to San Pedro. The East Coast Crips, spread across the East Side, were just as strong, just as proud, and just as ready to stand on business. But what was coming next wasn't just another round of shootouts. The 2000s changed everything. The police got smarter, the technology got faster, and the internet, that new digital world, started creeping into the game. Where older generations settled beef on the block, the new generation started flashing it online. MySpace pages turned into street billboards. Photos with bandanas, captions with disrespect, and videos where young homies called out rival sets. All of it fanned the flames. It was no longer enough to win on the street. You had to win the narrative too. The Broadway versus East Coast feud, which had cooled slightly in the late 90s, reignited hard in the early 2000s. Too many unsolved murders. Too many rumors. Too many lines crossed that couldn't be taken back. One of the darkest sparks came in June 2002. That summer, LA heat felt heavier than usual. On Slauson Avenue, a gold Chevy Blazer rolled down slow. Behind the wheel, a well-known Broadway hitter named Anthony Brumfield. Ahead of him, 2 6-deuce East Coast Crips, Kentrell Scott and Dantavius Marshall. Nobody knows what words were exchanged that day, or if it was just fate putting enemies on the same road. But the moment those cars lined up, the streets wrote another chapter in blood. Shots rang out. Brumfield opened fire, and chaos followed. Bullets shattered glass. Metal screamed. Dantavius hit the gas, but rounds tore through him. The car lost control and slammed into the Blazer. The impact threw Brumfield out onto the street. Dantavius was hit multiple times. He didn't make it. Witnesses later told police they saw a man running from the scene. A woman named Kesha Ward, who was in the car, identified Brumfield as the shooter. When the trial came, the truth cut deeper than any bullet. Dantavius Marshall was Brumfield's own cousin. flesh and blood on opposite sides of a street war. Brumfield got life without parole. Behind bars, he said the same thing in every interview, that he wakes up every day haunted by that moment, that the war made cousins into enemies, family into strangers. But out on the streets, that revelation didn't stop anything. If anything, it made things worse. The East Coasts wanted payback. The Broadways wanted to prove they couldn't be touched. The next 2 years were chaos. In 2004, the tension reached another breaking point. Corey Stone, an 11 Deuce Broadway, was riding through the 118 East Coast section in a green Cadillac. He spotted Eddie Willard, an East Coast member, standing on the corner. They locked eyes. Corey turned into the wrong lane, pulled up close. Words were exchanged, and then shots. Eddie hit the ground with 3 bullets in him. Corey peeled off, but the streets talk fast. Within days, police caught him on drug charges, and in his car they found 2 shell casings, same caliber used in Eddie's murder. In lockup, Corey talked too much. Placed with an informant, he bragged about the shooting, admitted he didn't clean up right, said he wasn't scared of doing life. He was right. He got 50 years to life for that murder. The war between Broadway and East Coast wasn't about money, dope, or territory anymore. It was about identity, about who controlled their blocks, their names, their pride. By 2005, the violence spilled back into neighborhoods that were already tired. One evening, 2 non-affiliates, William Johnson and David Hampton, were standing on a porch in the 5 Deuce Broadway area. The gray Chrysler pulled up. 2 6 Deuce East Coasts stepped out, Edward Hunter, and another known as Asmo. They walked past, nodded, said, "What's up?" then kept walking. Seconds later, the porch exploded in gunfire. Johnson went down instantly, hit multiple times. Hampton ran for cover, but it was too late. When the police arrived, they found shell casings, shattered glass, and 2 bodies. The shooters vanished back into the city. To outsiders, it looked like another gang killing. To the people who lived there, it was a message. Nobody was safe, not even civilians. And that was the part that broke the old heads. The OGs who had built these sets out of unity and survival now watched as the code got lost. The rules they once lived by, no women, no kids, no civilians, were being forgotten. The 2000s were colder, faster, more reckless. You could catch a case just by being in the wrong video, the wrong car, or the wrong MySpace picture. LAPD started using online posts as evidence, connecting dots between street names and screen names. Gang injunctions spread across South LA like wildfire. Young homies couldn't even stand on corners together without risking arrest. Broadway and East Coast both got hit with injunctions that banned them from wearing colors, flashing signs, or even being seen with known members. But that didn't stop the killing. It just made it quieter. Drive-bys turned into walk-ups. Walk-ups turned into setups. Enemies started popping up at house parties, gas stations, even family barbecues. At the same time, the outside world was changing. Rappers like The Game, Nipsey Hussle, and Jeezy were making the streets fashionable again. Gang culture was mainstream, but the real life behind it was still deadly. Nipsey, a Rollin 60s Crip from Slauson, tried to flip the narrative. He showed what it meant to build, to own property, to give back. But even that message couldn't erase the cycle that had already consumed generations. The Broadway versus East Coast War kept claiming lives. There were quiet years, but never peaceful ones. Retaliations became rituals. One side hits, the other side answers. And through it all, The police, the feds, and the city kept watching. They didn't see pain. They saw statistics. They didn't hear stories. They heard gunshots. By 2008, South LA was changing again. New faces were moving in. Young professionals, college students, investors. They were buying up homes on streets that once carried legends. But to the Broadways and East Coasts who grew up there, that land wasn't real estate. It was sacred ground. Every corner had a memory. Every alley, a story. As the digital age grew, YouTube and social media started showcasing hood life in ways the world had never seen. Videos of blocks, interviews with OGs, memorials for fallen soldiers, all went viral. The streets had become content. But behind every view was a family still grieving, and behind every like was another set plotting revenge. The early 2000s ended with both Broadway and East Coast, smaller in numbers, but heavier in scars. Their war had gone from the street to the internet, from the block to the courtroom. The soldiers who survived weren't legends. They were ghosts walking through a city that had forgotten them. And as the 2010s approached, the war wasn't over. It was just evolving. New generation, new codes, new ways to die. By the time the 2010s came around, the streets of South Central Los Angeles didn't look the same, but they still felt the same. The walls that once carried gang tags now carried murals of rappers, activists, and faces of the dead. The smell of smoke from late-night shootings had been replaced by the aroma of coffee shops and new construction dust. But beneath the surface, the tension never left. It just went quiet, buried under fresh paint and real estate signs. The Broadway Gangster Crips were still around, holding what was left of their blocks from 52nd Street to 112th, staying rooted in a part of LA that was slowly being taken from them. Across town, the East Coast Crips, from 6 Deuce to 8-9, were still standing strong. The name still held weight, even as the city tried to erase what those names meant. The generation that came up in the 2000s were now older, wiser, but many were gone. Some were buried, some were in prison, and a few were trying to start over. And for the first time in decades, the younger generation wasn't just thinking about the block. They were thinking about the brand. Music, social media, and the internet had turned the streets into a global stage. Instagram made hoods visible to the world. YouTube channels were dropping hood documentaries, interviews with OGs, and raw clips straight from the streets. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about Broadway, East Coast, Hoovers, Rollins 60s, Bounty Hunters. All the names that once only meant something to locals were now keywords, hashtags, search results. But with fame came danger. Old rivalries that had cooled were reignited online. Diss tracks and comment section disrespect replaced street corners and alleys. Young homies started live streaming from blocks where their fathers once fought. And once again, the internet blurred the line between entertainment and survival. In the middle of it all, LA's rap scene exploded again. Artists like G. Perico, repping 11 Deuce Broadway, brought authenticity back to the microphone. He wasn't just another rapper. He was the voice of the section. When he rapped about the hood, it wasn't fiction. It was autobiography. His blue Chuck Taylors, his khaki suits, the block energy in his videos. All of it reminded the world that Broadway wasn't gone. It had just evolved. But success in LA's street rap scene came with shadows. The streets never let you forget where you came from. And sometimes, the very fame that could save you could also make you a target. The East Coast Crips had their own come-up stories too. Young rappers, producers, and hustlers, trying to turn the pain of the streets into something bigger. But they were doing it under constant pressure. Gentrification was sweeping through the city like a slow, quiet storm. Old black families were getting priced out, new residents moving in. Blocks that had seen decades of bloodshed were now lined with renovated apartments, yoga studios, and vegan cafes. Developers didn't have to fight for territory. They bought it. The same corners where homies once lost their lives were being sold for millions. For the Broadways and East Coasts, that kind of change was hard to swallow. It wasn't just the loss of turf. It was the loss of identity. The hood they fought for no longer belonged to them. Some tried to adapt, starting businesses, opening stores, linking with local nonprofits to create mentorship programs. Others didn't see the point. To them, it was still the set before anything else. And when new people moved in and called the police over gatherings, car washes, or block parties, it was a reminder that the world didn't want them there anymore. But the streets never forget. Even when the gunfire slowed, the memories stayed loud. The war between Broadway and East Coast wasn't like it used to be, but it was never truly over. Old heads from both sides still carried pain, still remembered faces, still told stories of brothers lost in senseless retaliation. Around this time, the LAPD shifted its strategy. Instead of raids and helicopters, they started using surveillance, digital monitoring, and data analytics. They watched social media. They listened to lyrics. They tracked clicks and comments. Every post, every video, every diss, it all became evidence. The digital world became a new battlefield, and the Broadways and East Coasts, like many sets across LA, found themselves fighting not just rivals, but algorithms and law enforcement that understood their every move. Still, through the chaos, there were sparks of light. Ex-gang members turned mentors started popping up in documentaries, interviews, and podcasts. Men who once shot at each other now sat at tables discussing reform, redemption, and the future of South LA. But the truth was, peace didn't sell. The internet wanted conflict, not healing. The algorithms rewarded drama, not change. And so the same cycle kept spinning. Online arguments turned to street fights turned to funerals, and the news turned those funerals into headlines. Through it all, the legacy of Broadway and East Coast became more than just colors. They became chapters in Los Angeles history, symbols of loyalty, pain, power, and loss. The city had changed. The people had changed. But the war stories, they were eternal. Passed down through generations, told at candlelight vigils, tattooed on arms, remembered in the beats and bars of LA rappers still carrying the torch. By the late 2010s, the names still echoed. Broadway, East Coast, Hoover, Rollins 60s, all part of a story that would never truly end. Because even when the streets grow quiet, the past still speaks. And in South Central, the past never dies. It just changes its name. The 2020s arrived with a strange silence over South Central Los Angeles. It wasn't the same kind of silence that used to follow a shooting or a raid. This one was heavier. It was the silence of time. The sound of a neighborhood that had seen too much, lost too much, and changed too much to ever go back to what it was. The Broadway Gangster Crips were no longer the same crew that had started back in the 1970s. Most of the original OGs were gone, locked up, passed away, or simply moved on. But the name still carried weight. It still meant something on the streets, even if the blocks they once ruled were now lined with condos and high-end apartments. The East Coast Crips were in the same boat. Their neighborhoods, once filled with tension and fear, were now part of a city that was becoming unrecognizable. Gentrification had turned war zones into business districts. Old corner stores became coffee shops. Graffiti murals of fallen soldiers were covered by new paint jobs and parking garages. But to the people who came from there, the memories didn't fade. The ghosts of the past still walked those streets. Every old street sign, Slauson, Imperial, Century, Avalon, Broadway, still carried a story. In the early 2020s, the new generation looked different. They didn't grow up in the same kind of chaos their fathers did, but the culture still touched them. The identity of the set was still powerful, even if the streets themselves had been transformed. Social media had turned the hood into history, archived, edited, documented, and streamed. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels were telling the stories that the news had always ignored. And, for the first time, the world was listening. The stories of Broadway and East Coast were no longer whispered in the dark. They were being told on camera by the men who lived them. Some were repentant, some still angry, but all of them carried the same look, a 1,000-yard stare that said, "We survived what most wouldn't." For many, survival was the only prize. Decades of funerals, indictments, and street wars had left entire generations scarred. Some former soldiers turned mentors, trying to stop young kids from walking the same path. Others struggled to find peace, haunted by things they'd done or seen. In 2020, when the pandemic hit, the whole world slowed down, even the streets. For the first time, the city of Los Angeles was quiet. No traffic, no movement, no night noise. And in that silence, reflection set in. People started realizing how much the city had changed. South Central was no longer the epicenter of violence it once was, but the trauma was still alive. And even though the shootings had slowed, the pain hadn't healed. When Nipsey Hussle was murdered in 2019, the whole city felt it. He wasn't Broadway or East Coast, but his death hit every corner of LA, because Nipsey represented something bigger. The dream of changing the system from within, of turning gang ties into community ties, of owning what they once fought over. His loss was a mirror. It showed every set in the city what could have been, what still could be, if the cycle ever truly ended. In the years that followed, a quiet movement started growing. Former enemies sat down for the first time. Broadway and East Coast members, who once would have shot at each other on sight, now talked about peace, business, and rebuilding what the system had taken. Not in front of cameras, but in backyards, community centers, and old gyms. The city still had violence, but it also had something else: wisdom. A generation of survivors who had seen both sides, the rush of power and the cost of it. Some of them spoke in schools. Some opened barbershops, clothing lines, or car washes. Some simply told their stories to whoever would listen. And through those stories, something powerful began to happen. The truth started replacing the myth. For decades, outsiders only saw the headlines: gang, murder, drugs, prison. But the real story was deeper. It was about poverty, pain, broken systems, and brotherhood, twisted by circumstance. Now, in the 2020s, that story was being rewritten. Still, for all the progress, the shadow remained. You could gentrify the blocks, tear down the buildings, and rename the streets, but you couldn't erase the history written in blood. The Broadways and the East Coasts weren't just gangs. They were reflections of a city that made them, used them, and then tried to forget them. Every generation carries the echo. The young ones still say the names with pride, even if they don't fully understand the wars that built them. The old ones still visit the grave sites, still wear the colors at reunions and funerals, still tell the stories like folklore passed through time. And when the sun sets over South Central, the city still feels the same hum, that invisible tension in the air, that unspoken memory that lingers in every cracked sidewalk and chain-link fence. The war between Broadway and East Coast didn't have a winner. It never could. It was a story of pain and survival, a mirror of what happens when a city forgets its people and its people turn on themselves. But it's also a story of strength, of men and women who, against all odds, endured, who lived long enough to see their kids walk free of the same chains that once held them. Today, when you drive down Broadway or Avalon, you don't see the same hood from the 1980s or 1990s. You see rebirth. You see murals of Nipsey, of Tupac, of the fallen soldiers from every set. You see a generation trying to build something different out of the rubble left behind. The story of Broadway Gangster Crips versus East Coast Crips isn't just a tale of violence. It's the story of Los Angeles itself, a city built on dreams and divided by lines that should have never been drawn. And even though the war is mostly over, the memories still breathe through every streetlight, every tattoo, every beat of an LA rap song that still shouts out the section. The legacy is written in concrete, in music, in the hearts of those who made it out alive. The Broadway Gangsters, the East Coast Crips, two sets bound by history, rivalry, and the same unbreakable truth. They were both products of the same city, fighting to survive in a world that never gave them a chance. Because in Los Angeles, the past is never really past. It just waits under the streetlights for someone to tell the story again.